She had been stripped of her badge, escorted to the parking lot, and told she was finished, and then, 18 minutes later, 83 people arrived bleeding. The emergency room descended into a level of chaos that no protocol had ever prepared them for. Gurneys collided in the corridor. Monitors flatlined without anyone answering. A surgeon stood frozen at the entrance to Trauma Bay 2, staring at bodies he didn't know how to prioritize. And outside, walking toward her car with her hands still shaking from humiliation, a woman in scrubs stopped, turned around, and looked back at the building she had just been thrown out of. She already knew what none of them inside had figured out yet. They were going to lose people tonight. Not because the equipment failed, because they had just fired the only person who knew what to do. Before we go any further, if stories like this are the reason you stay up past midnight, you are exactly where you belong. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week we bring you narratives that will make your jaw drop, your chest tighten, and your sense of justice shake itself completely awake. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has already traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Harlow Sinclair had worked in emergency medicine for 11 years, and in that time she had learned one thing about hospitals that nobody put in any orientation packet. The people who made the most noise were rarely the ones doing the most work. She had come to Crestfield Regional Medical Center in Spokane, Washington, 14 months earlier, transferring from a smaller facility in Eastern Oregon without fanfare, without a letter of recommendation that impressed anyone, and without the kind of social fluency that made administrators like her on site. She was 36, white, medium height, with the kind of quiet competence that people tended to mistake for arrogance or worse, insubordination, because she never softened a clinical concern with a smile, and she never pretended to agree with something she believed was going to hurt someone. In a hospital like Crestfield, that was a liability. Crestfield was not a bad institution in the way that some hospitals were bad, understaffed, underfunded, physically crumbling from years of neglect. It was bad in the more insidious way, the way where everything looked functional on paper and the dysfunction lived entirely inside the hierarchy. The trauma floor was run by Chief Surgeon Dr. Dominic Farrell, a man who had published papers, attended the right conferences, and shook the right hands at the right fundraising dinners. He had a particular talent for performing competence in rooms full of people who couldn't verify the performance, and a particular contempt for anyone in a subordinate position who could. He treated the nursing staff the way a certain kind of man treats weather. An inconvenience to be managed around, not a force worth understanding. Harlow had made her first enemy within 3 weeks of arriving. It was a chest tube placement, a male patient, mid-50s, blunt thoracic trauma from a vehicle collision on the interstate. Farrell had positioned for the procedure, and Harlow had noted quietly, professionally, using the tone she had been taught in a context that Farrell knew nothing about, that the entry site looked too low given the patient's respiratory pattern, and the imaging she had personally reviewed twice before opening her mouth. Farrell had not looked at her. "Hand me the clamp." "Dr. Farrell, the angle you're positioned at relative to his chest wall and the imaging pattern on his left lower lobe suggests." "Hand me the clamp, nurse." She handed it over. He performed the procedure. The patient spent an extra 4 days in recovery from a complication that 2 of the attending nurses later whispered to each other was entirely avoidable. Nobody documented it that way. Nobody ever wrote the word avoidable anywhere near that file. The system was very good at absorbing those events without leaving marks. After that, Harlow's name appeared on a different kind of list. Not the list of nurses who were celebrated at department meetings or nominated for internal recognition awards. The informal, unwritten, completely deniable list that existed in every hierarchical institution, the list of people who needed to be managed downward until they either left voluntarily or gave someone a reason to make them leave involuntarily. She was assigned the worst scheduling blocks, the overnight to dawn rotations, combined with short turnarounds that left inadequate recovery time and were technically legal, only because somebody had once decided. That technical legality was the appropriate standard. She was excluded from case review meetings that other senior nurses attended as a matter of course. When a new clinical coordinator position opened up, she found out about it from a colleague 3 days after the posting had closed, too late to apply, early enough to understand that the timing was not accidental. When she submitted a formal safety concern report about supply chain irregularities she had observed in the medication dispensing system, the report went into the compliance office and nothing came back out. None of this was documented. None of it left fingerprints. That was the point. Harlow noticed all of it. She kept working. She was precise and fast and thorough in a way that didn't call attention to itself, and the patients who moved through her section of the trauma floor had outcomes that, statistically, would have raised questions if anyone had sat down and run the comparison against floor averages. No one ran that comparison. Numbers at Crestfield were applied to budgets and billing and performance metrics designed to satisfy accreditation bodies, not to the kind of granular outcome analysis that might surface something inconvenient about who on the clinical staff was actually keeping people alive. What sustained her through 14 months of this, what kept her functional in the specific way that she needed to be functional, was something she didn't talk about and actively worked to keep invisible. She was not the kind of person who processed difficulty by sharing it. She went home to her apartment near the river. She ran 6 miles every morning at 5:30, regardless of temperature or whether she had slept. She cooked simple food and ate it without distraction. And she carried whatever she was carrying in the private way of someone who had learned long ago that the interior life is the only territory over which a person retains full sovereignty. She had a lot of interior territory. What the hospital didn't know what she had spent 4 years engineering into invisibility was that Harlow Sinclair had not always been a trauma nurse at regional medical centers in the Pacific Northwest. Before Spokane. Before the quieter facility in Oregon, where she had started to rebuild herself. Before the woman she had methodically constructed over 4 years of deliberate anonymity existed at all. She had been someone else entirely, in a different kind of uniform, performing a different category of trauma work in environments that didn't appear on any map that civilians had access to. She didn't think about that. She had made an agreement with herself 4 years ago in the specific and harrowing clarity that follows a catastrophic institutional betrayal that she would not go backward. The past was sealed. What she had done, and who she had been, and what had been done to her in return, all of that lived behind a door she kept locked. Not from weakness, but from the practical understanding that a person could not function in the present while actively bleeding from the past. The lock had held for 4 years. The incident that ended her tenure at Crestfield Regional happened on a Tuesday in early November at 6:14 in the evening, 43 minutes before the scheduled end of her shift. She had flagged a post-operative patient, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Holt, 48 hours out from an abdominal repair procedure, because the patient's vitals had begun trending in a pattern that Harlow recognized the way someone recognizes a piece of music heard once in a context that ended badly. Not alarm, recognition. Respiration elevated in a subtle but consistent upward gradient over 6 hours. Blood pressure declining in increments, small enough to be individually attributed to medication timing, positional changes, or normal postoperative fluctuation, but not small enough, in aggregate, to be ignored by someone who had learned to read the aggregate rather than the individual data point. Abdomen slightly but measurably more distended than it had been during the morning assessment, identified not by any monitor but by Harlow's hands during what was nominally a comfort check. She paged the attending physician twice, at 15-minute intervals. No response. She went to Farrell's office. He was not alone. He was with the hospital's administrative director, a man named Victor Strand, and they were deep in a conversation involving a printed spreadsheet covered in figures that had nothing to do with patient care. They had the particular absorbed quality of two people discussing something they found considerably more interesting than medicine. Harlow knocked once and opened the door. "This patient needs imaging," she said, without preamble or apology. "Room 412. I think she's bleeding internally." Farrell turned from the spreadsheet with the slow deliberateness of a man managing the visible expression of his irritation in front of an audience. "Which patient?" "Diane Holt. Post-op day 2 from the Morrow repair. Her pressure has dropped 11 points since this morning in a pattern that isn't consistent with medication timing. Her respiration is elevated and has been trending upward since 1,400 hours. Her abdomen is more distended than I saw her this morning." He said it with the finality of someone closing a file. "She's stable. She was stable this morning. She isn't presenting the same way now." Strand looked between them with the expression of a man who managed budgets and found clinical conflict aesthetically unpleasant. Farrell set his pen down. "You interrupted an administrative meeting to tell me a post-operative patient has a slightly fluctuating pressure reading." "I interrupted a meeting because her attending is not responding to pages, and I believe she is developing either a hematoma or an active bleed that is going to become a crisis within the next 60 to 90 minutes if we don't image her, and I am not able to escalate this through the attending channel. Based on her vitals over the past 6 hours, her current presentation, and my manual assessment of her abdomen." "Your manual assessment?" "Yes." He stood, slowly, and with the particular physicality of a man who understood that standing was a statement about who controlled the geometry of a room. "You have been a source of disruption on this floor since the day you transferred here. You question clinical decisions that fall outside your scope of practice. You generate anxiety in your colleagues. You challenge attending physicians using a tone that is not appropriate to your position." He crossed toward her in the measured way of someone who had practiced this kind of movement. "I have been patient with you, Harlow, because I understand that nurses sometimes develop confidence that exceeds their training. But what you're doing right now is not clinical advocacy. It's a pattern. Dr. Farrell, I'm telling you this specific patient. Go back to your station." The silence that followed was exactly 3 seconds. Harlow counted it. "If she deteriorates," Harlow said, "and we didn't image her after I reported clinical concern at this time, that concern in this conversation will appear in my documentation. Time stamped." Farrell's expression didn't change in any visible way. But something shifted underneath it, in the way that still water shifts when something moves beneath the surface. "Victor," he said, "give us a minute." Strand gathered his spreadsheet and left with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for permission to do exactly that. What followed in the next 8 minutes was a conversation that Harlow would never describe in full to anyone because she couldn't remember it, but because it was the kind of conversation that existed precisely in the space between what is said and what is meant, the administrative fluency of institutional power that leaves no record and needs none. Farrell did not say "you're fired." He said things like professional compatibility and the confidence of the surgical team and a culture of mutual respect. And by the time he finished, both of them understood with complete clarity that her employment at Crestfield Regional was over. She walked back to the floor with her face neutral and her thoughts in a specific holding pattern she had learned to use a long time ago in situations where the appropriate response to complete the immediate task before processing the larger one. She sat at the documentation terminal and she wrote the most thorough, precise, timed clinical note she had ever produced in 14 months at this hospital. She documented Diane Holt's vitals in full, her own assessment findings, both pages sent to the attending, and the time and outcome of her escalation to the chief surgeon. She flagged it urgent. She saved it in triplicate through the system's backup protocol. Then she walked to the charge nurse desk, Bev. She kept her voice at the same register she used to order supplies. I need you to watch 412. Bev was a woman in her late 50s who had worked this floor longer than some of the attending physicians had been practicing medicine. She had the specific intelligence of someone who had learned to read between every line of clinical communication without ever acknowledging that she was doing it. She looked at Harlow and wrote the room number down without asking a single question. I know, she said simply. Harlow collected her bag from her locker. She put on her jacket. She walked through the corridor toward the exit with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided that how she leaves a place matters. She was almost to the automatic doors when she heard Farrell's voice come through on the security desk radio. She didn't catch the words, only the tone, and then she saw the result. 2 security officers materializing from the side corridor and moving toward her with the careful, impersonal expressions of people executing an instruction they personally found uncomfortable. Miss Sinclair. The taller one extended his hand, palm up. We need your badge. She unclipped it from her lanyard. She placed it in his hand without breaking eye contact. She walked between them, through the automatic doors, and out into the cold November air. The parking lot was lit by a row of yellow overhead lights, one of which flickered erratically as she passed beneath it, and she found the intermittent quality of that light almost appropriate in a way she didn't bother to analyze. She sat in her car. She did not start the engine immediately. She sat with the silence and the cold that was beginning to seep through the door panels, and she let herself feel exactly what she felt, which was not primarily anger. Anger was too clean, too simple, but something more complicated and familiar. The specific weight of an institution deciding that the risk you posed to itself was greater than the value you provided to the people inside it. She had felt this weight before. She knew how to carry it. She moved the car. She had moved approximately 40 feet toward the parking lot exit when her phone buzzed on the center console. It was a text from Bev. They imaged 412. You were right. She's going back to OR. Harlow stopped the car. She sat with that information. Diane Holt was going back to surgery because Harlow had been right about what was happening inside her body, and Farrell had dismissed it. And the only reason they had caught it in time was because Bev had kept watching and someone had finally ordered the imaging. Harlow had been right. They had known she might be right, and they had removed her anyway, because in the mathematics of institutional self-preservation, being right was less important than being manageable. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was not Bev. It was the County Emergency Coordination System, the broad distribution alert that went to every registered medical professional in the region when an event exceeded what normal emergency response could absorb. Mass casualty incident, industrial explosion, Colburn Processing Facility, East Spokane. Preliminary estimate 80-plus casualties. Injuries include blast trauma, burns, crush injury, inhalation. Crestfield Regional Medical Center, designated primary trauma receiving facility. All available medical personnel requested to report. She read it once. Then she read it again. She looked up from the phone and through the windshield at the glass-fronted entrance of Crestfield Regional, and she could already see the change, the visible acceleration inside the building. Staff moving differently, phones appearing, the specific body language shift that she had seen before in places and circumstances that had nothing to do with hospital administration. The shift that happened when a system designed for one level of demand suddenly understood that it was facing another level entirely. 80 or more casualties from an industrial processing facility explosion. Blast injuries meant tympanic membrane ruptures, pulmonary contusion, blast lung, the insidious injury that could look stable for hours and then accelerate into respiratory failure in under 20 minutes. Burn injuries meant fluid resuscitation calculations, airway management, The race against the inflammatory response, that would begin in the tissues within the first 30 minutes. Crush injuries meant rhabdomyolysis risk, compartment syndrome screening, the renal cascade that nobody thought about until it was too late. Inhalation trauma meant upper airway edema that could close off in a time frame that made surgical airway management the only remaining option. Harlow had managed all of these, not in simulation, not in textbook scenarios during nursing school clinical rotations, in actual environments, actual patients with actual consequences when the assessment was wrong or the intervention was slow. She also knew, with the specific precision of someone who had worked that floor for 14 months, exactly what the ER was capable of right now. She knew which nurses were on shift and what each of them could handle under pressure. She knew how many attending physicians were physically in the building versus on call from home. She knew the actual functional capacity of the trauma bays, which differed from the listed capacity in the facility documents by a number that was, in an event of this scale, critically relevant. She sat in the car for 31 seconds. Old habit. She counted. Then she got out. She did not run. Running in a parking lot was theatrics, and she had never had time for theatrics. She walked with the efficient, ground-covering stride of someone who had a destination and intended to reach it. Back through the automatic doors, past the security desk, where the taller of the two officers who had taken her badge looked up and visibly startled, his mouth opening on something he clearly didn't know how to say. She walked past him without slowing, onto the floor. It was already coming apart at the edges. Not catastrophically, not yet, but in the specific way that a system begins to fail when the load exceeds the design, not all at once, but in distributed small failures that individually looked manageable and collectively were not. The first civilian vehicles had arrived, ahead of the ambulance convoy. People who had loaded injured colleagues or bystanders into personal trucks and driven to the nearest hospital without waiting for emergency coordination, which was always how it began. A man with full-thickness burns on both forearms was being supported through the entrance by two people who looked too shaken themselves to be reliably useful. A woman had collapsed near the intake desk and was being attended by one nurse when she needed 3. In the cluster near Bay 2, a pair of nurses were audibly debating, which bay assignment was appropriate for a patient with compound lower leg fractures, when the person on the gurney beside him, a young man whose breathing had an audible quality that any trained clinician should have immediately flagged, was receiving exactly 0 attention. Harlow reached the young man first. He's got a tension pneumothorax. She said it to Leo, a nurse she had worked beside for the better part of a year, who happened to be standing closest. I need a 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Right now, Leo. Leo turned and looked at her with an expression that briefly contained the administrative situation. Harlow, they said you were feral, said Leo. She kept her voice at exactly the register required. Not loud, not soft. The register that foreclosed argument. Do you have the needle, or do I need to find it myself? He ran for the supply cart. She was already at the woman on the floor by the intake desk, one hand on the pulse point at the wrist, the other moving to the scalp laceration that was bleeding with the exuberant quality of head wounds, alarming to look at, less dangerous than it appeared. But the altered responsiveness was the actual concern, and that came from somewhere else. She called for a cervical collar, called for CT priority, and redirected the 2 extra nurses toward the burns patient who was going to need IV access and fluid calculation before anything else if they were going to get ahead of the systemic response. She moved. The floor had a particular quality in crisis, a quality she had learned in settings that were nothing like a hospital, where individual clarity and collective confusion existed simultaneously, and the person who could translate their own clarity into direction for others was the single most valuable resource in the room. Not the most skilled, not the most credentialed, The person who could stay oriented in the disorientation and make that orientation contagious. Harlow moved through the floor that way. She triaged. She directed. She caught an error in tourniquet placement that another 40 minutes would have converted into a much more serious problem. She identified a patient who had been assigned a lower acuity than her respiratory status, warranted burns on her upper chest and neck, the particular distribution that indicated inhalation exposure, and had her moved to immediate, with enough lead time that the airway management was controlled rather than emergent. She spoke to patients, briefly, directly, in the tone that communicated something more useful than information. The tone that said, "The situation is serious, and I am not panicking," which means panic is not the required response here. It was a tone she had practiced in environments where panic could get people killed, and it worked in a trauma bay, because the mechanism was the same. Calm was not the absence of urgency. It was urgency organized. Nobody told her to stop. Farrell was in surgery. She checked the board at the 40-minute mark and confirmed it. He would be there for hours. Whatever conversation they were going to have would happen later. Victor Strand she saw once, standing in the administrative corridor, with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, watching the floor with the expression of a man whose calculations had just encountered a variable he had not accounted for. At the 90-minute mark, Bev materialized at her elbow. "You should know that Farrell is going to surface at some point." "I know, and when he does." "Bev." Harlow was reading a monitor without looking up. "Where are we on O-negative inventory?" Bev paused the other conversation, without visible resistance. "Blood bank says there's a hold on 2 units. They couldn't tell me why." "Release them. Any elective procedure hold is irrelevant tonight, and the blood bank coordinator knows that. If they need a physician order, get the hospitalist on call to sign it." She handed the chart to a passing nurse with a specific instruction attached. "Marcus needs to be at the Bay 3 intake point. He's been in Bay 1 for the last hour, and Bay 1 is running fine without him." Bev was already moving toward Marcus before the sentence was complete. At the 2-hour mark, Harlow became aware of something changing near the main entrance. It wasn't any single element. It was the aggregate, the way perception sometimes works, assembling a conclusion from inputs that haven't yet individually crossed the threshold of conscious recognition. A change in the quality of movement near the front doors. A sound that was different from the sounds the crisis had been generating for the past 2 hours. A reconfiguration of the security staff posture near the main entrance that had nothing to do with incoming casualties. She was at Bay 4, reviewing the oxygen saturation trend on a 40-year-old man with blast lung, when she let herself look up. 4 military officers had entered the main corridor. Behind them, 3 more. They were in service dress, not field gear, not anything that suggested tactical deployment, but the formal uniform of official institutional visit. 2 of them had already produced credentials and were speaking to personnel near the administrative corridor. One was taking a measured visual inventory of the floor, with the eyes of someone assessing an environment rather than simply looking at it. And one of them, the one at the center of the group, the one everyone else in the group organized themselves around without apparent coordination, had stopped walking and was standing still in a way that was different from the stillness of someone who had paused. It was the stillness of someone who had arrived. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, built with the particular density that came from decades of a specific kind of physical life. His service dress was immaculate. His rank insignia was visible from across the room. 4 stars. Harlow looked back at her patient's chart. She heard one of the officers beside him say something too quiet to carry across the noise of the floor. She heard the general's response, also quiet, also not intended to carry. But she heard it anyway. "That's her," he said. She finished the notation she was writing. She capped her pen. She slid the chart into the rack with a click. Then she turned. He was already walking toward her. Unhurried, with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that urgency was a resource to be allocated, not performed. He moved through the organized chaos of the trauma floor, without adjusting his pace for the way a person moves through whether they have dressed appropriately for. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her with the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who has been looking for a person for a very long time. "Harlow Sinclair," he said. Not a question, not a greeting. Confirmation. She met his eyes and held them steady. "That depends on who's asking." General Thomas Wicker, United States Army. The name landed in the air between them and she did not react to it. She had spent 4 years practicing the absence of reaction. But somewhere below the practice, something shifted, the way a sealed room shifts when a window is opened from outside. "I'm told I'm no longer employed here," she said. "That's a hospital matter." He glanced around the floor, brief, comprehensive, registering without expressing, and something in his face acknowledged what he was looking at without commenting on it. "We need to speak privately. When your floor is stable enough." "It isn't stable yet. I'm aware." He didn't move. "I'll wait." She looked at him, at the 4 stars, at the officers behind him, who had fanned out with a purposeful quiet that was becoming, the longer she observed it, increasingly difficult to interpret as anything other than an investigative deployment. 2 of them were showing credentials to Victor Strand, who had emerged from the administrative corridor and whose face had taken on a color and texture that reminded Harlow of concrete left in rain too long. "General Wicker," she said, and her voice was level. "What is actually happening here?" He held her gaze and spoke with the directness of a man who had decided that she had earned the unmediated version. "Your military record was falsified 4 years ago. We know who authorized it. We know who executed it. And we now know how you ended up at this hospital." He paused, and the pause had weight. "It was an accident, Harlow. None of it was." Behind her, the trauma doors opened. Another gurney, another voice calling for a nurse. Another human body requiring the things she had trained for, the older training and the newer one both, and she was standing at the intersection of all of it, the life she had rebuilt, and the reason she had needed to rebuild it, arriving simultaneously, converging on this floor on this night, and in this cold November hospital that had spent 14 months trying to make her feel like she was nothing. "How long have you known?" she asked. Wicker's jaw shifted slightly. The only tell he allowed himself. "Too long," he said. "I'm genuinely sorry for that." She looked at him for one more second, at the stars on his shoulder, at the officers surrounding Strand like a slow tide coming in, at the administrative director's face, which had now achieved a new and remarkable quality of fear, and then she turned back to the gurney, to the patient, to the work that did not stop, because the world was reorganizing itself around her. Her hands, as she reached for the trauma cart, were not completely steady. She noticed it. She noted it the way a pilot notes an instrument reading. Filed it. Continued. But the door she had kept locked for 4 years was no longer entirely sealed, and both she and the man standing behind her in 4-star service dress knew it. The patient on the gurney was a man in his late 40s, construction built, with the broad hands and weathered skin of someone who had worked outdoors for most of his adult life, and the particular gray pallor that had nothing to do with sun exposure. Burns on his right shoulder and upper chest, partial thickness from what Harlow could assess visually in the first 3 seconds, but it was his breathing that held her attention, shallow, labored, with an audible component on the inhale that told her the airway was beginning to swell from heat exposure, and that the window for managing it without a surgical airway was narrowing in real time. "What's his name?" she asked, the paramedic pushing the gurney. "ID," says Warren Briggs. "Found him about 30 feet from the east wall of the facility. Witness said he was conscious at scene, went out in transport." "How long in transport?" 14 minutes. 14 minutes of progressive airway edema. She pulled a pen light and checked his pupils, equal reactive, which told her The unconsciousness was respiratory rather than neurological. And then she tilted his head, looked at his throat, and made a decision that she did not debate with herself, because debate required time, and time was the one thing she did not have. I need RSI set up now. Ketamine and suck, video laryngoscope, bougie on standby. She looked at the nurse who had appeared on the other side of the gurney, a young woman named Priya, third year, steady hands, and a tendency to go quiet under real pressure. Priya, you're bagging him while I set up. Slow and controlled, don't force it. Priya took the bag valve mask and positioned without responding verbally, which was the correct response. The intubation took 4 minutes, not fast by the standards of a clean airway in a controlled setting. Fast by the standards of a partially obstructed airway in a bay that had 3 other active patients in her peripheral vision and a 4-star general standing 60 feet away, waiting to dismantle the last 4 years of her life. Warren Briggs was breathing through a secured tube when she stepped back and stripped her gloves. She allowed herself one breath, one full breath, in and out, the kind that reset the nervous system rather than indulging it. Then she turned back to the floor. General Wicker had not moved. He had positioned himself against the wall near the nursing station with the practiced patience of a man who had spent a career waiting in situations considerably less comfortable than a hospital corridor. 2 of the officers who had come in with him were no longer visible, which meant they had moved deeper into the administrative section of the building. The 3rd was standing near the entrance to the supply corridor, speaking quietly into a phone. And Victor Strand was still in the administrative corridor, but now he was not alone. A woman Harlow didn't recognize civilian clothes, the particular posture of a federal agent. Credentials visible at her hip was standing beside him with a tablet in her hand and the focused expression of someone taking notes on things that Strand clearly did not want documented. Harlow clocked all of this in under 4 seconds and moved on. The floor had reached a different phase. The initial explosion of arrivals had metabolized into something more sustainable, not calm, nothing close to calm, but the organized version of crisis rather than the chaotic one. The ambulance transport had organized itself into a coordinated intake rhythm. The most critical patients were stabilized or in surgery. The patients who needed monitoring were being monitored. The patients who needed comfort were receiving the reduced, inadequate version of comfort that a mass casualty situation allowed, which was not enough, but was what existed. Bev appeared at Harlow's elbow at the 3-hour mark with 2 things: a paper cup of coffee that was neither good nor warm, and a look that contained a specific kind of information. Farrell's out of surgery. Harlow took the coffee. How long? Scrub nurse texted me 10 minutes ago. He's in the surgeon's lounge. Does he know Wicker is here? I don't think anyone's told him directly. But Strand went in there about 5 minutes ago. Bev paused. Strand looked like a man walking into something he didn't know how to walk out of. Harlow drank the coffee. It was bad. She drank it anyway. Keep Marcus on Bay 3 intake until we're below 40 active patients, she said. When we cross that threshold, he can rotate back to Bay 1. And somebody needs to check on the 2 inhalation cases in the overflow section I want updated. SAT readings every 20 minutes, not 30. Bev was already writing. The general keeps looking over here. I know. You going to talk to him? When the floor can hold without me for 15 minutes. Harlow handed back the empty cup. Not before. That moment came 40 minutes later, and it came imperfectly, which was the only way moments like that ever actually arrived. The floor wasn't stable in any meaningful sense of the word. It was less unstable than it had been, which in emergency medicine was the practical equivalent of stable, and was accepted as such. She walked to where Wicker was standing. He straightened slightly, not in the performative way of a person trying to look attentive, but in the automatic way of someone whose body had been trained to signal readiness through posture. There's a family consultation room at the end of that corridor, she said. It should be empty. It was. She closed the door behind them and did not sit down. and he did not suggest that she should. Start from the beginning, she said. The real beginning. Wicker looked at her for a moment in the particular way of someone deciding how much of the truth they owe a person and concluding that the answer is all of it. 4 years ago, he said, you were the primary medic on a CASEVAC operation in a designated restricted zone. 2 of the personnel you extracted were carrying physical documentation, encrypted drives that evidenced a procurement fraud network operating inside the military contracting system. The network had been running for 6 years. The people running it had significant reach inside the Army's administrative infrastructure. I know what I extracted, Harlow said. I was there. Then you know that 3 days after the operation, you were brought up on charges of unauthorized conduct and falsification of mission reporting. I know what I was charged with. I also know that the evidence used to charge me was fabricated. Yes, he said it, without qualification or softener. It was. We know that now with documentary proof. At the time, the investigation was controlled by 2 senior officers who were themselves part of the network. They managed the outcome. Your record was altered. Testimony from the soldiers you extracted was suppressed. One of them was transferred out of the country within a week of your hearing. The room was small, and the air in it was the recycled air of hospital consultation spaces, slightly too warm, slightly too still. Harlow stood with her back to the wall and her arms at her sides, and she listened to the confirmation of everything she had spent 4 years knowing was true and being unable to prove. The documentation, she said, from the extraction. What happened to it? It went into a classified evidence hold and sat there for 2 years while the network's administrative reach kept it buried. Then one of the soldiers you extracted, a man named Patrick Osee, made a second set of copies of the original were impounded. He kept them for 2 years, and then, when he separated from service, he went to the Inspector General's office directly. Wicker paused. It took another 18 months to build the case, to the point where action could be taken. The investigation has been federal for the past 8 months. 8 months, Harlow said. The words came out with a quality she didn't attempt to modulate. You've had enough to act for 8 months. The federal component required. I'm not asking for an explanation of the timeline, General. I'm noting what the timeline means. He absorbed that without defending it. She credited him for that. You said I ended up at this hospital for a reason, she said. That it wasn't accidental. His expression shifted. Not dramatically. He was not a man who did things dramatically, but in the specific way that presaged information that was harder to deliver than what had come before. Crestfield Regional Medical Center has been under federal investigation for 9 months, he said. The hospital has financial entanglements with Vantage Defense Partners, which is one of the primary corporate entities in the procurement fraud network. Manipulated pharmaceutical procurement contracts. Falsified supply invoices. Medical equipment billing irregularities that over 6 years amount to several $1 million in fraudulent federal reimbursement. Harlow was still. Someone inside the network identified that you had taken a position here, Wicker continued. We believe you were brought to this hospital, recruited, specifically, though not in any way you would have recognized to be monitored. Possibly to be discredited if you showed signs of having retained any of the information from the extraction. They've been watching me. For the past 8 months, at minimum, possibly longer, the consultation room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when the thing being said in them is large enough to absorb the ambient sound. Harlow looked at the opposite wall for a moment. There was a laminated sheet on it explaining visitor protocols printed in 4 languages, the kind of institutional document that existed everywhere in hospitals and that no one ever read. Who inside the hospital, she said. It was not quite a question. That's what my people are working on right now. Is it Farrell? Farrell is under review. But our current assessment suggests he was primarily a facilitator, someone who created conditions that were useful for the network without a necessarily understanding the full scope of what he was facilitating. The connection is more likely administrative. Wicker paused. Strand has been our primary focus. Victor Strand. She said it with a flatness that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite confirmation. It was the sound of something clicking into alignment that had been almost aligned for a long time. The spreadsheets, the particular quality of his attention during the confrontations with Farrell, the way he had materialized in administrative spaces at moments that, in retrospect, carried a different weight. We're not at the arrest stage with Strand yet, Wicker said carefully. We're at the documentation stage. And Farrell? His situation is separate. There's a pattern in his surgical outcomes that a federal medical review board has been examining for the past 4 months. That's a different case, but it intersects. She turned this over in her mind with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to process complex operational information without letting the emotional component of it interfere with the analytical one. It was a skill she had developed in uniform and had never unlearned. "What do you need from me?" she said. Wicker looked at her steadily. "Your testimony. Formally, on record, with legal representation provided. Everything you remember from the extraction operation. Everything that happened in the 3 days before the charges were filed. Everything you observed during your time at this hospital that you believe to be relevant. And my record? The process of expungement and restoration is already in motion. It was initiated 6 weeks ago." He held her gaze. "It should have been initiated 4 years ago. I won't offer you a justification for why it wasn't, because there isn't one that holds up." She looked at him for a long moment, at the 4 stars. At the specific quality of his expression, which was not pity. She would not have tolerated pity, but something closer to an accounting. The look of an institution, embodied in one man, acknowledging a debt that could not be fully repaid and not pretending otherwise. "I need to get back to my floor," she said. "I know." She opened the consultation room door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "The soldiers from the extraction," she said, without turning around. "Osi and the other one. Are they both alive? Both separated from service?" Osi is the one who came forward. "The other, a man named Darius Webb, has been in federal protective contact for the past 3 months. She nodded once. She didn't say anything else. She went back to the floor. The floor had not collapsed without her, which was what she had trained the team for, and was not, therefore, a surprise, though it produced a specific satisfaction that she did not take time to examine. Marcus had Bay 3 running with the organized calm of someone who had found his footing in the crisis and was now operating from it rather than reaching for it. Priya was at Bay 1 monitoring the intubated patient, Warren Briggs. She reminded herself. He had a name with the focused attention of someone who had decided that this patient was her patient and that nothing was going to happen to him on her watch. Harlow had reached the nursing station and was pulling up the updated census when Bev said, very quietly, "Farrell's coming." He came from the direction of the surgical suites, still in scrub pants and a clean top, his hair pressed flat on one side from the surgical cap. He had the particular energy of a man who had received incomplete information and was attempting to project authority over a situation he didn't yet fully understand. He stopped when he saw Harlow at the nursing station. The stop was involuntary, a half-second freeze that he recovered from quickly, but not quickly enough. "What?" he said. "Are you doing on this floor?" "Reviewing census." She didn't look up from the monitor. "You were suspended. Your badge was mass casualty event, doctor." "Farrell," I responded as a licensed medical professional. She kept her voice at the neutral register. "The documentation of what I did tonight, and when I did it, is thorough and time-stamped." He moved toward her with the particular momentum of a man who was angry enough that the anger had briefly outrun his judgment. "I don't care what the circumstances were. You are not authorized to be on this. Dr. Farrell." The voice came from behind him. Farrell turned. One of Wicker's officers, a woman, mid-40s, in service dress with the specific bearing of someone who had delivered difficult news before and had learned to do it with a minimum of theater, was standing 4 feet away with credentials in her hand. Major Leanne Cord, Army Inspector General's office. I need a few minutes of your time. She said it the way people say things when the word need is doing considerably more work than it normally does. Farrell looked at the credentials. He looked at the officer. He looked at Harlow. Something moved through his face in that sequence of looks, something that started as anger and passed through confusion and arrived at a place that Harlow recognized, because she had seen it before in people who had operated for a long time under. The assumption that they were insulated from consequence. It was the look of a man realizing that the insulation may have been less complete than he believed. I have patience, he said. His voice had lost its edge. Your residents are covering surgical recovery, Cord said. This won't take long. She paused precisely 1 beat. It'll be easier in a private space. Farrell went with her. He didn't look at Harlow again. Bev materialized at Harlow's shoulder the moment they were gone, with the timing of someone who had been watching the situation from a careful remove and had waited for exactly this moment. Lord, Bev said very quietly. Don't, Harlow said, but there was something in her voice that was not quite its normal register. I'm not saying anything. Good. She went back to work. The next 2 hours had the quality of a long descent, not downward in the sense of deterioration, but downward in the sense of returning to ground from a height. The mass casualty event was subsiding from its acute phase. The incoming casualty rate had slowed as the scene at Colburn Processing was brought under control, and the critical patients were either in surgery, in the ICU, or stabilized in monitored beds. The trauma floor was still running well above its normal census, but it was running. The machinery of it was functioning because the people operating it had been pushed past their ordinary capacity and had discovered the way people in crises sometimes did, that the ordinary capacity was not the actual limit. At some point, she didn't check the time. She never checked the time during sustained operations. It was a habit she had built in a context where clock checking was a distraction. Leo appeared beside her with a look on his face that was specific enough that she stopped what she was doing. There's a woman asking for you, he said, not a patient. She's been waiting in the Bay 2 corridor for about 20 minutes. I told her you were occupied, and she said she'd wait. Who is she? She said her name is Dr. Sylvia Rourke. She's on staff here. Emergency physician. She's been on leave for the past month. He paused. She said she needs to talk to you, specifically. She said she's been trying to figure out who to tell something to for the past 3 weeks, and she thinks you might be the right person. Harlow looked at Leo for a moment. Tell her 10 minutes, she said. It was actually 17, because between Leo's message and Harlow, extracting herself from the floor, a patient in Bay 1 developed a secondary complication that required her hands. And Harlow's hands went where they were needed rather than where she had scheduled them to go. By the time she reached the Bay 2 corridor, she had been awake and working, without a real break for 6 hours, and she was running on the specific fuel that adrenaline provides in its later stages. Not energy, exactly, but the absence of the physical signals that normally indicated its depletion. Dr. Sylvia Rourke was sitting in a chair against the wall with her coat still on and her hands clasped in her lap with the particular stillness of someone who had been sitting that way for long enough that it had stopped being a posture and become a state. She was in her early 40s, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was normally expressive and was currently very carefully not being so. She stood when she saw Harlow. You're Sinclair. I am. Rourke glanced toward the corridor entrance. It was an involuntary glance, the kind that belongs to someone who has developed a habit of checking who is nearby before they speak. I need to tell you something that I should have told someone a month ago. The reason I didn't, she stopped. The reason doesn't matter. I'm telling you now. Harlow waited. I was placed on administrative leave on October 8th, Rourke said, ostensibly for a documentation error in a billing submission. I've been an emergency physician for 16 years, and I have never had a billing complaint. The documentation error they cited was in a file I didn't create. She kept her voice flat and controlled in the way of someone who had rehearsed this enough times that emotion had been edited out, though its ghost was still present. Before I was placed on leave, I had been raising concerns internally about pharmaceutical procurement irregularities, specifically about a pattern in our scheduled drug inventory that didn't reconcile with the patient administration records. I brought it to the pharmacy director, who told me she'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I was on leave. Harlow looked at her without speaking. I know how that sounds, Rourke said. I know the timeline looks like retaliation, Harlow said. Because it is. Rourke exhaled. The exhale had the quality of something that had been held for a long time. There's a name, she said, in the procurement records on the irregularities I found. The same name appears as the authorizing signature on 5 different anomalous transactions over 14 months. It's not Strand. It's not Farrell. She paused, and the pause had the density of something about to change the weight of the room. It's someone on the clinical staff. Someone I worked beside on this floor every day for 2 years. Before Rourke could say the name, the corridor door opened. Harlow turned. A woman in a white coat stood in the doorway. She had been on the floor earlier. Harlow had registered her peripherally during the triage operation without focusing on her, the way you registered all the staff in your environment without cataloging each one. Early 40s, precise features, the kind of clinical stillness that read as competence until you looked at it in this specific context and understood it differently. She looked at Harlow. She looked at Rourke. And the look was enough. Rourke went very still beside her. Dr. Aldridge, Rourke said, and her voice had changed in a way that was not subtle. The woman in the white coat Aldridge held the doorway for one long moment, with an expression that was doing the specific work of appearing to be nothing, while containing something that Harlow's nervous system, calibrated by years of training she was not supposed to have, recognized as calculation. I was looking for the census update on Bay 3, Aldridge said. Her voice was level. Wrong corridor, Harlow said. Aldridge looked at her. A look that lasted approximately 2 seconds longer than a look between strangers needed to last. Then she stepped back from the doorway and was gone. Harlow turned to Rourke. That's her. It wasn't a question. Rourke's face had confirmed it before either of them spoke. Yes, Rourke said quietly. Dr. Mara Aldridge. She has been on this floor for 3 years. And she just heard enough to know that I've been talking. Down the corridor, past the nursing station, past the administrative wing where federal officers were still working documents that Strand had not wanted anyone to see, a door closed with a sound that was quiet and ordinary and meant something that neither of them could yet fully see the shape of. Harlow moved first, not toward Aldridge. Aldridge was already gone. The corridor empty in the particular way that spaces become empty when someone has left them with purpose rather than simply walked out. She moved toward the nursing station because the nursing station was where the internal communication system lived, and the internal communication system was what she needed in the next 30 seconds before anything else. She found Major Cord before Cord found her, which under the circumstances was the better outcome. The IG officer was in the administrative corridor with a laptop open on a rolling cart and a phone pressed to her ear, and she looked up when Harlow appeared in the doorway with the attentive sharpness of someone who had trained herself to read urgency in faces. Harlow waited until Cord ended the call. It took 11 seconds. She counted. Dr. Mara Aldridge, Harlow said. She's on the clinical staff here. Emergency physician. 3 years on this floor. She just walked in on a conversation between me and Dr. Sylvia Rourke, who's about to give me Aldridge's name as the authorizing signature on the fraudulent procurement transactions. She paused one beat. Aldridge knows that Rourke has been talking. She left the corridor approximately 4 minutes ago. Cord was already closing the laptop. Where is Doctor? Rourke now? I told her to stay in Bay 2. She may or may not have listened. Cord was on her phone before the sentence finished. She spoke in the clipped, information-dense shorthand of someone coordinating with people who needed facts, not context, and she was moving toward the Bay 2 corridor while she spoke. Harlow followed, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she had introduced this problem into the operational situation, and the operational situation was therefore partly hers to manage. Rourke was still in the chair. She had not listened, or more precisely, she had listened, and then been unable to make herself move, which was understandable. She had been carrying whatever she knew for 3 weeks, and the relief of having said it, and the fear of the having said it, and the consequence of having said it, were apparently occupying the same space in her nervous system and producing paralysis as the output. Cord spoke to her quietly for about 90 seconds. Harlow stayed near the corridor entrance and watched the door. At the other end, the one Aldridge had retreated through. It didn't open. That was either reassuring or it wasn't, and Harlow wasn't certain which. She left Cord with Rourke and went to find Wicker. He was where she had left him, or close to it. He had moved to the family waiting area, adjacent to the main corridor, which was technically a more appropriate place for a general officer to station himself than leaning against a nursing station wall. He was speaking in low tones with one of the other officers, a younger man with the specific attentiveness of a junior officer who had learned to be useful by anticipating needs rather than waiting to be told about them. Wicker looked up when he saw her face. "We have a problem," she said. "Tell me," she told him. All of it in the compressed, sequenced way she had been trained to deliver field reports situation. What changed, what she did, current status, what she didn't know. It took under 2 minutes. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had not always found in senior officers, and appreciated more now than she once had. When she finished, he looked at the junior officer. "Find Cord. Tell her we need Aldridge's location confirmed, and that if she attempts to leave the facility, we need to know immediately." The junior officer moved. Wicker looked back at Harlow. "The procurement documentation Rourke identified, is it in the hospital's internal system?" "I don't know. Rourke would know. I need her to walk my people through it. If the records are in the system, and Aldridge has administrative access, there's a window where she could attempt to alter or delete before we secure them." Harlow looked at him. "How long do you need to get a preservation order on the hospital's electronic records?" "If I make the right call right now, 40 minutes. Make the call." He was already on the phone. She went back to the floor because the floor still needed her, and need did not pause for institutional crises. Warren Briggs, the intubated patient from the explosion, the man with the burns and the compromised airway, had been transferred to the ICU, which was where he needed to be, and Priya had gone with the transport, which was not strictly necessary, but was the kind of decision that Harlow was not going to correct, because Priya's instinct to stay with the patient she had committed to was a clinical instinct worth preserving rather than trimming for efficiency. The remaining active patients on the trauma floor had been reduced to a census that the night shift could manage without the emergency overlay, which meant that the emergency overlay, the particular version of herself that Harlow had deployed for the past 6+ hours, could begin to withdraw. She sat down for the first time. The chair was at the documentation terminal, at the far end of the nursing station, and she sat in it without allowing herself to catalog what sitting down felt like after 6 hours on her feet in a mass casualty situation, because cataloging it would make it harder to get up again. She pulled up the documentation queue and began working through it, because the documentation was both necessary and a kind of task that allowed the body to rest, while the mind performed the specific mechanical work of medical record completion. She had been at it for 22 minutes when Leo appeared. He had the look of someone who was delivering information he hadn't been asked to carry, and wasn't sure how it would land. Farrell's back on the floor, he said. She kept typing. Doing what? He was at the surgical board for a few minutes. Then he went toward the pharmacy corridor. Leo paused. He looked, I don't know. He looked like someone who just got out of a conversation he didn't expect to be in. Did Cord's people follow him? I don't know if they did. I didn't see anyone go after him. Harlow stopped typing. Farrell, moving toward the pharmacy corridor after an interview with federal investigators, had a reading she didn't like. Me. The pharmacy corridor was where the controlled substance dispensing system lived, the same system whose inventory irregularities had triggered Rourke's initial concerns and, ultimately, Rourke's administrative leave. If Farrell understood enough about what was being investigated to know that the dispensing records were evidentiary, and if his response to that understanding was to go toward the pharmacy subogentism rather than away from it, then the timeline on Wicker's record preservation order mattered more than Harlow had assessed 2 minutes ago. She stood. Where exactly in the pharmacy corridor? He went past the main dispensary, toward the back annex. The back annex of the pharmacy corridor housed the secondary medication management system, the backup dispensing terminals that processed overflow requests during high census periods. And that, because they were secondary systems on a secondary network, were subject to slightly less rigorous access logging than the primary terminals. She moved. She did not run. She walked fast, with the particular efficiency that looked unhurried to anyone watching but covered ground, at a rate that running would not have significantly improved. Through the main corridor, past the administrative section where she could hear the background noise of Cord's operations, the particular sounds, the particular hum of people working a deadline, and into the pharmacy corridor. It was quiet. The main dispensary was locked and dark. The overnight pharmacist was at the far end, separated from the back annex by 2 sets of locked doors and the entire length of the corridor. The back annex door was not locked. It was slightly ajar, which was not how it was supposed to be at this hour. Harlow pushed it open. Farrell was at the terminal. His back was to her, and he was typing with the concentrated urgency of someone who was not doing routine work. He did not hear her come in, or if he heard her, he did not respond in time, because by the time he started to turn, she was close enough to see the screen. It was the dispensing reconciliation interface, the same one Rourke had flagged. And Farrell was not checking records. He was in the amendment pathway, the correction interface that allowed authorized physicians to flag dispensing discrepancies for review, which also happened to be the pathway through which the underlying transaction records could be annotated and, in specific circumstances, edited. He finished turning and looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence had a specific texture to it, not the silence of tactics to it, but the silence of 2 people who had nothing day, of 2 people who had too much to say, and were each calculating the geometry of the situation before committing to a position. Harlow, he said. He had stopped using nurse sometime in the past 6 hours, without explicitly deciding to. Step away from the terminal, she said. This is a clinical. Step away from the terminal, Dr. Farrell. Right now. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. He was calculating she could see it, the specific quality of calculation that belongs to a person determining whether they are past the point of being able to manage a situation or whether one more action might still change the outcome. She took out her phone. That was what decided it. Not the words. The phone. The implication of what the phone represented: documentation, transmission, the irrevocable fact of a timestamp attached to this moment, produced a visible change in his posture. His shoulders dropped a specific fraction of an inch. His hand came off the keyboard. I was reviewing the inventory, he said, and even as he said it, the register of his voice told her he understood how it sounded. I know what you were doing. She had already photographed the screen. The timestamp was automatic. Walk out of this room. He walked out. She called Cord's number on her way to the door. Cord picked up on the second ring, and Harlow gave her the back annex location and what she had found in the 23 words required to convey it. Cord said she'd have someone there in 3 minutes. Harlow stayed in the doorway of the back annex with Farrell standing in the corridor in front of her, neither of them speaking, until a young federal officer arrived at a pace that was technically not running. It was actually 2 minutes, 40 seconds. She counted. Farrell was escorted back toward the administrative section. He went without resistance, professionally, which told her something about the interview with Cord that she hadn't been present for. Whatever Major Cord had said to him in that private room, it had taken something out of him that didn't come back. Harlow looked at the terminal, at the amendment interface, still open on the screen with Farrell's access credentials, logged at the top. She did not touch it. She backed out of the room, left the door as she had found it slightly ajar, and documented her account of what she had observed, including timestamps in 3 separate places, her personal notes application, a text to Bev, who she trusted to exist as a secondary record, and a formal written account submitted through the hospital's incident reporting system, which tonight of all nights would be reviewed. She went back to the floor. The floor was quieter now. Not quiet. A trauma floor, receiving the overflow from a mass casualty event, was not quiet, but operating in the lower register of managed crisis rather than the higher register of active emergency. She did 2 more patient checks. She reviewed the morning handoff board with Marcus, who had found something close to his footing and found something in the past few hours and deserved to know it. And she told him so in the direct, undecorated way that she had learned was more useful to people than elaborate praise. You handled Bay 3 intake well, she said. The routing decisions were right. Marcus looked at her for a moment, as if he wasn't sure what to do with that. Thank you, he said finally. She left him to the handoff. It was 2:47 in the morning when she found herself at the window at the end of the West Corridor, not because she had intended to stop there, but because her feet had brought her there in the particular way of a body that had been operating on directive for hours and had briefly run out of directives. The window looked out over the hospital's north parking structure. The lights of the city were visible beyond it. Spokane arranged in the dark in the ordinary way of cities at 3 in the morning, mostly still, with the specific points of movement that belonged to the people who operated in the hours, when the rest of the world was absent. She stood there for 4 minutes. She was not meditating or reflecting in any organized sense. She was standing at a window at 3 in the morning after the longest shift of her life and the end of a 4-year architecture of concealment, and she was simply present in the particular way of a person whose system has temporarily run out of the capacity for anything more active than being present. She thought about Patrick Osei, who had copies for 2 years and then walked into an inspector general's office with them. She thought about the specific quality of courage required for that, not the dramatic kind, acute moment, not the unglamorous courage, but the sustained unglamorous courage of carrying something heavy for a long time and not putting it down. She thought about Diane Holt in her recovery room after surgery, whose name she would probably never hear again after tonight. She thought about Warren Briggs in the ICU, breathing through a tube that she had placed, whose name she also would probably never hear again. She thought about the lock on the door she had kept for 4 years, and she thought about what happened to structures built for concealment when the thing they were concealing was no longer necessary to conceal. She was still at the window when Wicker appeared in the corridor behind her. She heard him before she saw him. The specific rhythm of his walk was already familiar, which was a strange thing to notice about a man she had met 6 hours ago. The preservation order came through, he said. The hospital's electronic records are locked. Nobody can amend or delete anything in the dispensing system, the procurement files, or the billing records. I know about the back annex terminal, he added, before she could speak. Cord briefed me. The attempt was unsuccessful, and it's been added to Farrell's file. He paused. That was good work, finding him there. It was Leo who told me he'd moved toward the pharmacy. Then that was good work by both of you. He came to stand beside her at the window, not close, with the appropriate distance of two people who were colleagues in a situation rather than anything more than that. He looked out at the city for a moment before he spoke again. There's something I haven't told you yet. Something that came through in the past hour. She waited. The two senior officers who managed the fabrication of your record 4 years ago, he said. One of them has been under federal investigation for 18 months as part of the broader contractor network case. The other one resigned from the Army 8 months ago when the IG investigation expanded. He paused. He resigned, but he didn't go quietly. Before he left, he spent about 3 weeks attempting to locate your current position. We believe he found it. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. He's connected to someone at this hospital, Wicker said. Someone beyond Strand and Aldridge. Someone we haven't identified yet. And the reason we haven't identified them is that their connection to the network is more recent and less traceable. It appears to have been established specifically in relation to you. Specifically in relation to the possibility that you might eventually surface as a witness. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a monitor alarmed briefly and then stopped. The normal sounds of a hospital operating in the post-midnight register. You're saying there's a fourth person, Harlow said. At minimum. Someone whose primary function inside this hospital was not the original fraud. She worked through it as she said it, because saying it helped her think. Someone who was brought in or activated specifically to manage the risk I represented. That's our current working theory. Does Aldridge know who it is? We haven't been able to speak to Aldridge yet. The quality of how he said it made her look at him more sharply. She's not in the building. Harlow was still. When? She asked. We believe she left within 15 minutes of your corridor encounter with her. He kept his voice level informational. The parking structure exit camera shows her vehicle leaving at the timestamp that fits. We have a bolo issued. She has not been located. Aldridge had been in that corridor doorway, and she had assessed the situation in the 2-second look she had given Harlow and Rourke, and she had calculated her position, and she had left. In the time it had taken Harlow to brief Cord and Cord to organize the response, Aldridge had been in her car. Harlow thought about what Aldridge had taken with her. Not physical records, there was presumably nothing physical she could have accessed in 15 minutes of departure preparation. But knowledge. Whatever Aldridge knew about the network's operation inside Crestfield, about the fourth person, about the specific content of the records that Rourke had identified, all of that had walked out through the parking structure exit. The fourth person, Harlow said. They're still in this building. Possibly, not possibly. She thought about Aldridge's 2-second look in the corridor. The calculation in it. The fact that Aldridge had left, had removed herself, but had not sent any visible warning to anyone else before going. If Aldridge had been able to warn whoever the fourth person is, she would have done it before leaving, not after. She didn't reach out to anyone in the 15 minutes between the corridor and the parking structure, or you would have flagged that communication. Wicker looked at her carefully. We would have. Then she either couldn't reach them in that window, or she made a decision not to, which means she and the fourth person are not in close coordination. Harlow paused. Which means the fourth person may not know yet that Aldridge is gone. The implication settled between them in the particular way of information that changed the shape of a situation. If they don't know, Wicker said slowly, then they're still operating as if the situation is contained. And if they believe the situation is contained, their behavior in the next few hours is going to be different from their behavior once they find out it isn't. Wicker was already reaching for his phone. He made 2 calls in quick succession, and Harlow listened to enough of them to understand that he was repositioning people, not removing them from the administrative investigation, but layering a behavioral monitoring component that would pay attention to movement, communication patterns, and access attempts across the hospital's remaining overnight staff. While he was on the second call, Harlow's phone buzzed. It was Rourke. The text said, "I remembered something else." The fifth transaction. The authorization signature wasn't just Aldridge. There was a co-signature. I didn't look at it closely before. "I need to show someone." Harlow read it twice. A co-signature on the procurement transactions meant a second authorized party on the fraudulent records. It meant the fourth person might not be invisible after all. It meant there was a document, an actual document, inside the hospital's electronic record systems, now locked by Wicker's preservation order that contained their name. She forwarded the text to Cord without adding anything to it. Cord would understand what it meant faster than an explanatory note would help. Then she texted Rourke back, "Where are you?" The response took 45 seconds, which was long enough that Harlow noticed the length. "Pharmacy corridor. Dr. Cord's officer brought me to look at the dispensing records. We're at the main terminal." Harlow looked at the text. The main pharmacy terminal, the same corridor where Farrell had been found at the back next terminal 40 minutes ago. The corridor that was dark and quiet and separated from the main floor by two locked doors. The corridor where Rourke was now, with a federal officer, identifying a co-signature that named a person who was still inside this building and who did not yet know that their position had been exposed. She was already moving when Wicker finished his second call. "Rourke is in the pharmacy corridor," she said, not slowing. She found a co-signature on the procurement transactions. Wicker moved with her without asking for elaboration. He was on his phone again within 4 steps, and his voice had acquired a quality it hadn't had before, not louder, but denser, the way voices get when urgency has outrun the time available for its management. The pharmacy corridor was accessed through a door that required a staff keycard. Harlow had had it for 14 months, had never had it confiscated because confiscating keycards was a separate process from confiscating badges, and Farrell, in his anger, had apparently not thought through the administrative completeness of her removal. She swiped it. The light went green. The corridor was lit by the overhead fluorescence in the economy mode that the overnight system defaulted to full brightness at the main dispensary, reduced in the secondary sections. The main dispensary was lit. She could see the glow of the terminal screen through the dispensary window. She could not see Rourke. She could not see the federal officer who had been with Rourke. The door to the main dispensary was open, not ajar the way the back annex door had been, but fully open, swung inward, in the way of a door that had been opened quickly and not managed on the way through. Harlow went through it. The federal officer was on the floor beside the terminal. Not unconscious, she was moving, pushing herself upright with one arm while the other hand pressed against the side of her head. Alert, functional, but something had happened to her in the past few minutes that had not been part of the plan. "Rourke," the officer said. Her voice was controlled, despite the obvious disorientation. "She's gone. Someone came in, I didn't see their face. And Rourke," she stopped, steadied. They went out the back. There was a back exit from the main dispensary, a staff egress that led out into the secondary service corridor and from there to the hospital's back loading area. Harlow had used it once, months ago, during a supply delivery issue, and she remembered the layout. She turned. Behind her, Wicker was in the doorway. Behind him, one of his officers. She looked at the back egress door. Then she looked at Wicker. "The loading area exits to the east parking structure," she said. "If they go through the loading area, they have 4 exits to the street." Wicker spoke into his phone with a speed and precision that indicated the people on the other end were already in motion or would be within seconds. Harlow looked at the officer. On the floor, she was upright now, hand still pressed to her head, coherent, angry, in the specific way of a professional who had been caught off guard and was not going to let that define what happened next. "How long?" Harlow asked her. 3 minutes, maybe less. 3 minutes. The loading area was a 4-minute walk if you moved calmly and a 2-minute run if you didn't, which meant the window was not closed. It was narrow and narrowing, but it was not closed. Harlow pushed through the back egress door. The service corridor was fluorescent lit and smelled of industrial cleaner, a smell she associated with every back corridor of every medical facility she had ever worked in. She moved fast. At the end of the service corridor, the loading area, door-heavy, metal, the kind designed to be opened by people carrying supplies, was not fully latched. The hydraulic closure had not had enough time to complete its cycle. Someone had gone through it recently. Seconds ago, possibly. She pushed it open. The loading area was a concrete platform under overhead lights, half a dozen industrial bins along the far wall, a ramp descending to the vehicle access lane. Cold air, sharp with November after hours of recycled hospital interior. She stepped out onto the platform. She heard footsteps. Not running, moving fast, but not running. The sound of someone navigating the ramp down to the vehicle lane with the controlled speed of a person who had not yet decided whether they had escaped. She looked down the ramp. At the bottom, in the yellow-white wash of the access lane overhead lights, 2 figures. One of them was Rourke. She could identify the coat. The other figure was between Rourke and the exit, and they were holding Rourke's arm in the particular way of someone who had converted persuasion into compulsion without fully making the decision to do so, which was the most dangerous version of that transition. The other figure looked up, and Harlow, standing on the platform above the ramp, saw the face. It was not a face she expected. It was not Strand, who was already in federal custody, in all but the formal sense. It was not any of the administrative figures she had mentally mapped to the network over the course of the night. It was Dr. James Whitmore, internal medicine, 11 years at Crestfield Regional, the physician who sat on the hospital's clinical ethics committee, who had served 2 terms on the pharmacy oversight board, and who had, in 14 months of Harlow's tenure on the trauma floor, been reliably quietly, entirely unmemorable, the kind of institutional presence that accumulated trust through the simple mechanism of never doing anything that drew attention. He looked up at her from the bottom of the ramp, and the look contained something that she recognized as the specific expression of a person who has spent years managing the appearance of being one thing while being another, and is now, for the first time, being seen as the second thing by someone looking directly at them. Harlow, he said. He used her first name with the easy familiarity of someone who had always used it, which he had, and which now carried a completely different register than it ever had before. She looked at him, at his hand on Rourke's arm, at Rourke's face, which was frightened in a controlled way. She was holding herself together by a thread that Harlow could see was functional but not comfortable. "Let her go, James," Harlow said. The night air was cold. The access lane was empty. Somewhere above them, inside the building, the federal investigation was in motion, and the preservation order was holding, and the records that contained his co-signature were locked and completely beyond his reach. He appeared to be doing the same calculation she had just done, and arriving at the same conclusion, and arriving at the same conclusion. His grip on Rourke's arm changed the quality of it, the intention behind it, and Harlow was already moving down the ramp when the loading area's exterior lights went out simultaneously, plunging the entire space into the kind of darkness that had a specific cause, and that cause was not a power failure. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Harlow knew it was 4 seconds because she counted them the way she counted everything, not from anxiety, but from the trained understanding that time perception distorts under stress, and that accurate counting was the correction for that distortion. 4 seconds of complete darkness in the loading area, and in those 4 seconds, she did not stop moving down the ramp, because stopping on a ramp in darkness was more dangerous than continuing, and she oriented by the sound of Rourke's breathing and the memory of the spatial layout she had encoded when she stepped onto the platform. The backup lighting engaged on the 5th second. Not full illumination, The emergency system ran at 30%, casting the loading area in the flat amber of low-wattage safety lighting, but enough. Whitmore had moved. He was no longer at the bottom of the ramp. He was 4 feet to the left, and Rourke was beside him, and the grip on her arm had changed again, not tighter, but different in a way that made Harlow recalibrate, because the quality of how someone holds another person tells you something specific about what they have decided, and Whitmore had apparently decided something in those 4 seconds of dark. He had not decided to run. That was the first thing she registered. A person who had decided to run would have used the darkness to go, and he hadn't gone, which meant he had decided something else, and the something else was visible in the set of his shoulders, and the way he was standing, not the posture of flight, but the posture of someone making a final argument to themselves about whether a situation was retrievable. "The light's going out," Harlow said. She was at the bottom of the ramp now, 8 feet from him. "That was you." "Building management system," he said. "I have administrative override access through the pharmacy board." He said it at the flatness of a man who's past the point of pretending the information didn't matter. "I needed a moment." "You've had it." Harlow, his voice shifted register not to pleading. He wasn't there yet, but to the particular frequency of a person attempting to reframe a situation by addressing the other person as a peer rather than an adversary. "You don't have the full picture. I have enough of it. You have what Wicker told you, which is the version that serves his purposes." He glanced at Rourke briefly, then back to Harlow. "The procurement arrangement at this hospital, it was not what the federal investigation is characterizing it as. There were people in this building who were going to be harmed by a contractor network they had nothing to do with. The arrangement was protective." She looked at him steadily. "Protective of who?" "Of staff members whose records had been accessed by Vantage Defense Partners. People who were being leveraged. The co-signatures on those transactions were not authorizations for fraud. They were documentation that 2 physicians were aware of what the administration was doing so it couldn't be used against us later. It was a coherent story. It was internally consistent. It addressed the specific evidence that existed against him, and it was delivered with the earnest specificity of something that had been constructed carefully and rehearsed. Question. She had heard versions of it before, not this specific content, but this specific architecture. The reframe, the alternative interpretation, the appeal to a more complicated truth that happened to exonerate. "James," she said, let go of her arm. He looked down at his hand on Rourke's arm, as if he had briefly forgotten it was there, which she did not believe. He released it. Rourke moved immediately not toward Harlow, but sideways, putting distance between herself and Whitmore with the controlled urgency of someone who had been waiting for exactly that release and had the presence of mind not to run when running would complicate the geometry. Behind Harlow, the loading area door opened. She heard it without turning, heard the footsteps, 2 sets, the particular weight distribution of people moving fast in dress shoes on concrete. Whitmore heard it too. Whatever calculation he had been running reached its conclusion in that moment, visible in the way his face changed, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a television villain, but in the quiet, internal way of a person who has been holding a position for a long time and has just understood that the position is no longer tenable. He sat down on the concrete floor of the loading area. Not dramatically. He simply sat down with the slow deliberateness of someone whose legs have made a decision before the rest of them caught up. Major Cord reached Harlow's left shoulder. The other officer went directly to Whitmore. "Dr. James Whitmore," Cord said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone delivering a line that exists at the intersection of official procedure and genuine consequence. "I need you to come with me." He went. He went without the performance of resistance and without looking at Harlow again, and she watched him go with the particular feeling of watching something end that had been in the process of ending for hours. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but the specific release of a sustained tension, the way a sound stops, and you realize only in the silence how long you had been hearing it. Rourke was standing against the loading area wall. She had both arms crossed over her chest, and she was breathing in the deliberate way of someone managing their nervous system through conscious respiration, which was working approximately halfway.
Are you hurt?
Harlow asked her. No. Then my arm is bruised. He wasn't. He didn't. She stopped. No, I'm not hurt. Okay. Harlow looked at her for a moment. You did the right thing. Telling someone. Rourke's jaw tightened in the specific way that indicated she was not going to cry in front of anyone, which Harlow respected entirely. I should have done it 3 weeks ago. You did it tonight. That's what exists. She left Rourke with Cord's second officer and went back inside. The hospital at 4 in the morning had a quality that the hospital at any other hour didn't have a specific amplitude of silence under the functional noise. The sounds of monitoring equipment and distant conversation existing against a background that was quieter. It was quieter than the building was designed to be. She walked back through the service corridor, through the pharmacy corridor, and out into the main hall, and she stood there for a moment between the administrative wing, where the federal operations was still in progress, and the trauma floor, where her patients were still being monitored, and the family consultation room, where 4 hours ago a 4-star general had told her that 4 years of her life had been dismantled deliberately. She chose the trauma floor, not because it needed her. It didn't. Particularly the night shift was capable. Marcus was settled. The census was at a level that normal staffing could handle. She chose it because it was the place where she knew what to do with her hands, and she had learned over the years that knowing what to do with your hands was the most reliable of anchor available when the rest of the world was reorganizing itself without asking your permission. She checked Warren Briggs first. Not in person, she called the ICU and spoke to the nurse on duty, who told her his gas exchange was improving and his pressure was stable, which was the best news available given the severity of his initial presentation, and she received it as such. She checked the remaining trauma floor patients. She reviewed the documentation queue and completed 3 notes that had been flagged as incomplete. She found a medication discrepancy in Bay 3 that had nothing to do with any of the night's events and was simply the kind of error that occurred in overwhelmed systems, and she flagged it for the morning pharmacist with the time-stamped detail that made it correctable rather than consequential. She was at the nursing station at 4:23 in the morning when Wicker appeared. He looked like a man who had been awake for a long time and was comfortable with that, which she understood because she felt the same way, not the exhaustion of depletion, but the particular sustained wakefulness of someone whose system has committed to a state and intends to maintain it until the situation resolves. Whitmore is in federal custody, he said. Formal arrest in the next hour when the paperwork catches up to the situation. Strand is being transported to the federal building. Farrell has been formally suspended from surgical privileges pending the outcome of both the federal investigation and a separate medical board review that was already in progress. He paused. Aldridge was located 40 minutes ago. She made it as far as the state line before a patrol unit intercepted her vehicle. Harlow absorbed this and the documentation, the co-signatures. The records are intact, the preservation order held. Whatever Farrell was attempting at the back annex terminal, he didn't complete it. The amendment pathway he accessed logged the attempt, but the actual record was right protected from the moment the order came through. Wicker paused. Whitmore's co-signatures on 5 fraudulent procurement authorizations are fully documented and unaltered. What was his role specifically? Pharmacy board access. He was the second physician signature required on controlled substance procurement adjustments that were fraudulent, that diverted pharmaceutical inventory to Vantage Defense Partners distribution network, and that he authorized knowingly over a period of approximately 22 months. Wicker's voice was steady and informational, the voice of someone who had been in institutional accountability investigations, long enough to report this kind of finding without performing a reaction to it. His story about protective co-signatures is not supported by the records. He knew what he was signing. She nodded once. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "The former officer who resigned, the one who located you after the IG investigation, expanded. His name is Colonel Reginald Pratt, retired. He was the senior officer who managed the fabrication of your record 4 years ago. He watched her face when he said the name, and she gave him nothing, which he accepted without pushing. Pratt has been in contact with legal representation since this morning. Our assessment is that he is preparing to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced charging arrangement. He's going to give up the network. That's our expectation. The network above his level in exchange for mitigation below his. It's a calculation he's apparently been working through for some time. Wicker paused. His cooperation will include a formal account of the fabrication of your record. What was done, how it was done, who ordered it, and who executed it. The nursing station was quiet. The monitors made their regular sounds. Biv was at the far end of the floor, doing something with a patient chart. And the familiar quality of her presence 19 years on this floor, unshakable, quietly indispensable, was something Harlow noticed and was briefly, unexpectedly grateful for. "My record," she said. "The restoration. Where does that stand?" "The formal expungement order was signed 3 days ago. I have a copy for you. Your rank, your service history, your commendations. Everything is restored to the state it was before the charges were filed, with an addendum formally documenting that the charges were fabricated and the disciplinary action was unjust." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document paper, actual paper, the specific weight and quality of official military documentation. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment before she took it. She did not unfold it. She held it in both hands and looked at the outside of it, at the official Cecil, at the particular formality of its production. And she felt something that she did not attempt to name, because naming it would have required her to stop, and she was not ready to stop. She folded it again and placed it in the pocket of her scrubs. "Thank you," she said. It was the most complicated 2 words she had said in years, and Wicker received them with the gravity they deserved. Dawn came the way it always came in November in Spokane, reluctantly, in increments, the dark giving way to gray giving way to the particular pale light that arrived before the actual sun, and that Harlow had been watching through hospital windows for 48 of the past 72 hours in this building. She had worked a night shift enough times to know that the shift in light had a physical effect that was different from the psychological one, the body responding to photon input regardless of what the mind was doing with the information. She was at the nursing station when the day shift began arriving at 6:30. They came in carrying coffee cups and the ordinary morning energy of people who had slept. And they encountered a trauma floor that had processed a mass casualty event overnight and an administrative section that was cordoned off with federal activity that none of them fully understood yet. And they looked at each other and at the overnight staff and at Harlow specifically with the slightly stunned quality of people arriving at a place they thought they knew and finding it rearranged. Bev gave the day shift handoff with the comprehensive efficiency of 19 years of practice. And she included in it, without editorializing, in the same neutral clinical register, she used for everything a summary of the overnight events specific enough to be useful and general enough to avoid the details that were still under federal management. Harlow was updating the last of her documentation when the morning shift charge nurse, a man named Gary, who had worked the floor for 7 years and had a settled quality that she had always found professionally useful, appeared beside her. "You've been here since..." "Check the board." "Yesterday afternoon?" "Yesterday evening," she said. 4 o'clock shift. That's..." He stopped himself, recalibrated. "The board still shows you as suspended." I'm aware. So technically, Gary, she closed the documentation window. The people who suspended me are currently in federal custody or under federal investigation. The paperwork is going to catch up with itself. In the meantime, everything I did last night is documented, time-stamped, and clinically defensible. She looked at him steadily. Is there a patient problem you need me for right now? He looked at her. Then at the administrative corridor, which still had 2 federal officers visible near Strand's office. Then back at her. No, he said. No patient problem. Then I'll finish my notes. She finished her notes. At 7:15, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She answered it because unrecognized numbers at 7:15 in the morning after a night like this one were not unrecognized numbers in the ordinary sense. Miss Sinclair, male voice, middle-aged, with the precise diction of a lawyer. My name is Philip Archer. I'm legal counsel retained by the Army IG's office to represent your interests in the federal proceedings related to the Vantage Defense Partners investigation. I've been trying to reach you since midnight. I didn't have your number. No. General Wicker was supposed to provide it. I understand the evening was complicated, a pause that contained professionalism and possibly a degree of understatement. I'd like to arrange a time to sit down with you today, if that's possible. There are several things you need to be formally advised of before you speak to any investigators, federal or otherwise, in an official capacity. What things? Your rights in relation to your own testimony. The scope of the immunity arrangement being offered in connection with the investigation. And, another pause, there's been a development in the past hour that you should know about before you hear it through other channels. She felt the pause. What development? Colonel Reginald Pratt, Archer said. He filed a cooperation agreement this morning. As part of that agreement, he provided an initial statement to federal investigators. In that statement, he identified not just the fabrication of your military record, but a secondary operation that we were not previously aware of. She waited. Pratt states that after you were separated from the Army, the network maintained what he calls a risk monitoring file on your movements. He states that this file was not simply about watching you. He states that there were 2 separate occasions, one approximately 18 months after your separation, and one approximately 8 months ago, when the network assessed whether action should be taken against you to prevent you from becoming a witness. The day shift was in full operation around her. The floor was doing what floors did in the morning, the organized activity of patient care, the handoff energy, the normalcy of institutional routine. It existed around her like a parallel reality while she stood at the nursing station with her phone pressed to her ear. Action, she said, his word. He did not specify the nature of the action considered. He states that on both occasions, the assessment concluded that action was too high risk given your lack of active engagement with military or federal channels. Archer paused. He also states that the decision to place you at Crestfield Regional to facilitate your recruitment into a position at a network-affiliated hospital was made 8 months ago specifically to enable continued monitoring and, if necessary, more targeted management of the risk you represented. She looked at the nursing station, at the monitors, at Bev making notes at the far end, at the ordinary specific reality of the floor she had worked for 14 months, the floor she had been maneuvered into. She understood now by people who had decided she was a problem that required proximate management. They put me here, she said. It was not entirely a question. The recruitment process was influenced, yes. The position was real, the hospital's need was real, but the path that led your application to the top of the shortlist was not organic. She thought about 14 months. About Farrell's contempt and Strand's spreadsheets and the scheduling blocks and the missing job posting and the patient safety report that went nowhere. About the specific sustained experience of being made to feel like the problem in a system that had been arranged to produce exactly that feeling, not because she was a problem. but because making her feel like one was the most reliable way to keep her from becoming a different kind of problem entirely. They had put her in a position designed to diminish her. And when the night came, that tested the position. She had done the opposite of what they had arranged for. "Mr. Archer," she said, "when can you be here?" "I'm in the lobby," he said. "I've been here since 6. She almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She finished the last documentation entry. She closed the terminal. She looked at the floor at the full, organized activity of the day shift, running the system that the night shift had held together, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Philip Archer was in the lobby with a briefcase, and the particular look of a person who had anticipated a complicated day and had organized himself accordingly. He was compact, thorough-looking, with the kind of face that communicated competence before he opened his mouth, which she appreciated because she didn't currently have the patience for anyone who needed to establish it through conversation. They found an empty conference room, and she sat across from him, and he opened his briefcase, and for the next 90 minutes, she received the comprehensive version of her own situation in the formal language of law and federal process, and the specific obligations and protections of the agreement the IG's office was offering. And she listened with physical attention, listened with the full attention of someone who understood that the decisions made in this room in the next hour would have consequences that extended well past the end of the day. She asked questions. Not many. She had never been a person who asked more questions than she needed, but the ones she asked were precise, and Archer answered them without condescension, which established a functional working relationship in the first 20 minutes that continued for the rest of the meeting. At the end, she signed 3 documents. The third document was her formal agreement to testify as a principal witness in the federal investigation into Vantage Defense Partners and associated entities, including the specific testimony regarding the CASVAC operation 4 years ago, the fabrication of her military record, and her 14 months of observation at Crestfield MSP Regional Medical Center. She signed it with the pen Archer provided. She signed it clearly, without hesitation, with the full legal name that was now attached to a military record that said she was exactly who she had always been. She was returning the pen when Archer's phone buzzed. He glanced at it with the trained neutrality of a lawyer managing incoming information during a sensitive meeting. Then he looked up at her with an expression that was not quite neutral. "General Wicker is asking if you can come to the administrative conference room," he said. "He says it's important." "How important?" Archer looked at his phone again. "He says there's someone here who specifically asked to speak to you." He paused. "Someone who arrived at the hospital 20 minutes ago. He says you'll understand when you see who it is." She stood. She followed Archer through the main corridor, past the nursing station, past the administrative section with its federal presence, to the large conference room at the end of the administrative wing, the room used for board meetings and department reviews, and the kind of institutional occasions that required a table long enough to seat 12. Wicker was inside, 2 of his officers. Cord at the far end of the table with her laptop. Archer stepped in behind Harlow and found a chair, and seated at the near end of the table, looking across it at her with the specific expression of someone who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has arrived at the place where it can finally be put down, was a man she had not seen in 4 years. Patrick Osai, the soldier she had pulled out of a restricted zone in the dark, bleeding from a wound in his side, carrying encrypted drives that had cost both of them more than either could have anticipated. He was heavier than she remembered, with the particular settling that happened to people in their late 30s, and he was wearing civilian clothes, dark pants, a gray jacket, and he looked at her across the conference table with a steadiness that told her he had been sitting with this moment in his mind for a long time. "Harlow," he said. "Patrick," she said. The table was between them. Nobody suggested moving it. I should have come forward sooner, he said. I told myself I was waiting until the evidence was solid enough. I think that was part of it. He paused, with the honesty of someone who had been examining their own motives for long enough to report them accurately. I was also scared. I want you to know that I know that. She looked at him. She thought about 2 years of him keeping copies. 2 years of carrying the weight of what he knew and what had been done, and the specific, sustained courage of not letting it go. You came forward, she said. That's what happened. He nodded once. Wicker cleared his throat, not to interrupt, but to acknowledge that the moment needed to be allowed its duration without indefinitely displacing the operational purpose of the room. There's a reason I asked you both here together, Wicker said. Patrick arrived this morning to provide his formal testimony. Before we proceed with that, I wanted you both to see. He reached across the table and placed 2 documents side by side. Harlow's restored record and the formal federal acknowledgement that both of your accounts from the original operation have been confirmed by documentary evidence, and now part of the official record. She looked at the documents on the table. 4 years. The shape of 4 years, the Oregon facility, the move to Spokane, the construction of life designed around anonymity, the 14 months of Farrell's contempt and Strand's spreadsheets, and the specific daily effort of being underestimated by an institution that had been arranged to underestimate her. All of it had been moving toward this table, this room. These 2 pieces of paper lying side by side under fluorescent conference room lighting at 7:49 on a Wednesday morning in November. She was looking at the documents when her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it. She almost let it go to the recording that said she was unavailable because she was in a federal conference room and she had arrived at something that deserved her full attention. But the number on the screen was the ICU, she answered. Miss Sinclair. The ICU nurse, not the overnight one. The morning nurse, a woman named Diane she had worked with for months. I'm sorry to interrupt. We've been monitoring the patient you intubated overnight, Warren Briggs. He was extubated an hour ago, and he's breathing on his own. A pause. He's asking if there's a nurse named Harlow. He says someone at the scene told him. A nurse kept him alive, and he wants to know who she is. The conference room was quiet. Wicker was watching her. Osi was watching her. The fluorescent lights did what fluorescent lights did, indifferent to the quality of the moment they were illuminating. Tell him I'll come up when I can, she said. He also said, Diane hesitated. He said to tell you thank you. He said he has a daughter who's 8, and he wanted whoever it is to know that. She looked at the 2 documents on the table. Tell him I heard that, she said. She ended the call. She put her phone face down on the table, and she looked at Patrick Osi across the length of the conference room, and she looked at Thomas Wicker, and she looked at the restored record with her name on it, and the formal acknowledgement of 4 years of institutional wrong. And she thought about an 8-year-old girl whose father was breathing through his own lungs this morning, and some things that had been sealed behind a door for 4 years simply opened. Not dramatically, not with the release of something she had been suppressing. Just opened, the way a room opens when someone turns the key from outside and the mechanism works, the way mechanisms are supposed to work, and the air from one space moves into another. And both are different for it. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady. Let's get started. But before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened, and the federal officer who appeared in it had an expression that was not the expression of someone delivering a procedural update. General, the officer said, we have a problem. The cooperation agreement with Pratt, his lawyers are disputing the scope. They're claiming he only agreed to testify about the record fabrication, not the secondary monitoring operation. The officer paused. And Pratt is now stating that there are communications, encrypted communications, between himself and a party inside this hospital that he will only disclose if the agreement is amended. Communications that he says will change the nature of the entire case. Wicker's face did not change. But his jaw set in the specific way of a man who has been managing a complicated situation for a long time and has just encountered the next layer of it. "Party," he said. "He won't say yet." The officer looked at Harlow, then back to Wicker. "He'll honestly say that the person was not Whitmore, Aldridge, Strand, or Farrell." The conference room absorbed that. Harlow looked at Wicker. "There's a fifth person," she said. "That's what he's claiming. And the encrypted communications are still encrypted until Pratt provides the decryption key as part of an amended agreement." Wicker looked at her with the steady, flat attention of someone thinking through something he doesn't like the shape of. He says the fifth person was not a physician or an administrator. He says there's someone who has been in direct contact with you. The morning light through the conference room windows was the pale, flat light of November that told you nothing about what the day intended to do. Harlow sat in it and worked through the information, and she thought about 14 months and she thought up product and Thompson, everyone who had been in direct contact with her, and the specific quality of proximity that would have been useful to a network that needed to monitor someone without appearing to. She thought about who had always been there, who had always known her movements, who had access to clinical information and scheduling and the interior life of the floor in a way that was invisible, because it was unremarkable. She thought about a text received in the very first hour of the crisis. She thought about who had sent it, and the blood in her hands went very briefly, very precisely cold. The name arrived in her mind with the specific quality of something she had already known without knowing. She knew it not a surprise in the way that surprises feel sudden, but a recognition in the way that recognition feels inevitable. The way a shape you have been looking at from the wrong angle finally resolves into what it actually is. Biev, 19 years on the floor. Access to everything: scheduling, patient assignments, clinical notes, internal communications, the informal intelligence network of a senior charge nurse who knew every movement on the floor before it happened because her job required it. The person who had always been there, the person whose presence was so fundamental to the architecture of the floor that it had become invisible. The way load-bearing walls are invisible. You didn't notice them because removing them was unthinkable. The text in the first hour of the crisis, they imaged 412. You were right. She's going back to OR. Harlow had received that text and felt something she had interpreted as evidence of Bev's fundamental decency. She had not considered what else have been. What it looked like, from another angle, a message calibrated to keep Harlow emotionally invested, to bring her back into the building, to ensure she remained visible and present in a place where she could be monitored. She sat in the conference room with the cold in her hands, and she worked backward through 14 months. The scheduling blocks that kept her tired and isolated Bev had input on scheduling. The job postings she had missed Bev circulated, internal postings. The patient safety report that had gone nowhere submitted through a system that Bev managed the routing for. Every piece of the 14 months that had produced a slow, sustained erosion of her confidence and position had passed through or adjacent to the person she had trusted most on the floor. She looked at Wicker. "I need to verify something before I say a name," she said. He nodded once. No performance of urgency, no pressure. She credited him for that. "The text I received last night at the beginning of the mass casualty event, the one telling me that the patient in 412 had been imaged and was going back to surgery. Can your people pull the metadata on that message? Time sent, the device it was sent from, whether it was sent from inside the building or somewhere else." Wicker looked at Cord. Cord was already on it. The room waited. The kind of waiting that had weight, that everyone in it felt, but nobody performed. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then Cord looked up from her laptop. The message was sent from a registered hospital device, a staff issue phone assigned to the charge nurse on the trauma floor. "Beverly Marsh," she paused. The device pinged a cell tower that puts it inside the hospital at the time of sending. But Another pause, the kind that contained the complication. There's a secondary finding. The same device sent an outgoing message to an unregistered number, approximately 8 minutes before the mass casualty alert was issued. 8 minutes before the alert, before any civilian outside the emergency response network would have known the scale of what was coming. Before Harlow's own phone had received the county alert, someone had told Bev about the Colburn explosion before it became public. And Bev had passed it somewhere. She knew I was in the parking lot, Harlow said. She knew I had been suspended and was leaving the building. She knew what I would do if I received a message telling me I had been right about the patient in 412. She sent that message to bring me back inside, to keep you in a place where you could be monitored, Wicker said, and where the network's assets inside the hospital could manage the situation if the federal investigation showed up. She thought about Aldridge's appearance in the corridor, the timing of it, how Aldridge had found Harlow and Rourke together in a corridor that was not on any natural path between places Aldridge had reason to be. Someone had told her, someone had known where they were. Bev told Aldridge where we were, in the corridor. Cord was typing. I can pull the internal communication logs for that time window. Do it, Wicker said. Harlow stood. Where is she right now? She was on the floor 20 minutes ago. The officer in the doorway said she was already moving. Not because she had a plan that required her physical presence. Wicker's people were better positioned to manage an apprehension than she was, and she knew that. She moved because she had spent 14 months on a floor with a person who had been reporting her movements to a network that had spent 4 years treating her as a liability to be managed. And the information had a physical weight that required physical response. Wicker caught up to her in the corridor. Not to stop her, he matched her pace. Let my people do the formal part, he said. I know. But you're going to the floor. Yes. He didn't argue. He walked beside her, and behind them she heard Cord issuing instructions with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything Cord did. The trauma floor was in full morning operation. Day shift, full census, the organized activity of a hospital running its daytime protocols on the morning after a night that most of its staff were still processing in the background of their functioning. Gary was at the main nursing station. Leo was doing rounds. Priya had come back from the ICU and was updating the Bay 1 board with the focused quality of someone who had also been awake too long and had decided that work was the most reliable way to stay upright. Bev was at the medication cart at the far end of the floor. She was doing what she always did, organized, purposeful, the 19-year fluencies of someone who had performed these tasks so many times they had become autonomous. She looked up when Harlow came through the floor entrance. The look lasted 1 second. In that 1 second, Harlow watched Bev's face do something she had never seen it do in 14 months. Not guilt, it was more complicated than guilt. It was the specific Spreton guilt, expression of a person who has maintained a performance for so long that the maintenance has become indistinguishable from identity, and who is now looking at the moment when the performance ends and finding that they cannot fully calculate what lies on the other side of it. Harlow walked toward her. Bev set down the medication chart. She did not run. She did not reach for her phone. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she watched Harlow come, and she looked, for the first time, in all the months Harlow had known her, like someone who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the shift. How long? Harlow said. Bev looked at her. Harlow. How long, Bev? A pause. The floor moved around them, monitors, voices, the ordinary machinery of patient care, and in the middle of it, 2 women stood facing each other across the distance of a betrayal. Since before you arrived, Bev said. Her voice was flat. Not defiant, not apologetic. Flat in the way of someone delivering a fact they have made their peace with delivering. I was contacted 8 months before your transfer. They told me you were coming. They told me what they needed. What did they need? Your movements, your clinical concerns. Anything that suggested you were making contact with federal or military channels. Anything that looked like you were building a case. She paused. And if it became necessary, they needed someone who could facilitate the professional circumstances that would discredit you. The scheduling blocks, the job posting, the report that went nowhere. Facilitated, not incidental, not the byproduct of a system that happened to be hostile. Designed, delivered by hands that had also, on the same shift, poured bad coffee and written down room numbers and said, "I know," in the tone of a person who could be trusted. "The text last night," Harlow said, "bringing me back into the building. They wanted you inside, where they could see you." When the federal people showed up, Bev stopped, looked at a point somewhere past Harlow's shoulder. "I didn't know anyone was going to get hurt. I want you to know that." Sylvia Rourke was in a loading dock at 3 in the morning with a man holding her arm. "I didn't know it would go that far." For the first time, something moved in Bev's face that was not performance and not flatness. "Didn't know what Whitmore was. You knew enough." Viv looked at her directly. "Yes," she said. "I did." Behind Harlow, she heard Cord's people arrive 2 officers, the quiet professional movement of people executing a procedure they had done before. Gary at the nursing station had stopped pretending to work. Leo had stopped in the middle of the corridor. Priya was standing very still near the Bay 1 board, with a chart held against her chest. The floor was watching, not theatrically, not the way people watched scenes they had sought out, the way people watched something that was happening in its place they worked and lived and had trusted and were now understanding differently. Beverly Marsh was informed of her rights in the measured language of federal procedure. She listened. She did not protest. She did not appeal to Harlow again. She went with the officers with the same practical, self-contained quality that had characterized everything she did on this floor for 19 years, and she did not look back, and the floor watched her go in a silence that was the particular silence of collective reckoning. Harlow stood where she was for a moment. Then she turned and went back to work, because the floor still had patience, and patience did not pause for institutional betrayals any more than they paused for anything else. The 3 weeks that followed were not clean. They were not the tidy resolution of a situation that had required the surgical removal of its corrupted elements, and then healed smoothly. That was not how institutional damage worked, and Harlow had never believed otherwise. Dominic Farrell's surgical privileges were formally suspended by the medical board on day 4, pending the outcome of a clinical review that had been initiated separately from the federal case, but was now running in parallel with it. The review examined 11 cases over 3 years, including the original chest tube placement that Harlow had flagged in her 3rd week at the hospital. The findings were not exculpatory. He retained legal representation and issued a statement through counsel that contained the word context 7 times and the word accountability not at all. His attorney indicated he would contest the suspension. The medical board indicated they were prepared for that. Victor Strand was charged federally on day 6. The charges included wire fraud, healthcare fraud, and conspiracy 14 counts across 6 years of fraudulent procurement arrangements with Vantage Defense Partners. He appeared at his arraignment in a suit that was considerably more expensive than anything he had worn to the hospital, flanked by 2 attorneys, and he entered a plea of not guilty with the composed expression of someone who had been assured that composure was the appropriate strategy and was executing it. The federal prosecutor's office indicated that the documentary evidence was extensive and that they looked forward to presenting it. Mara Aldridge pleaded guilty on day 9 to federal conspiracy charges and agreed to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation. Her medical license was suspended immediately upon the guilty plea. Whatever she gave the federal case in exchange for her cooperation was not public, but the investigation's scope expanded noticeably in the 2 weeks following her agreement. James Whitmore's case was more complicated, as cases involving someone who had operated invisibly for 22 months inside an institution, tended to be. His initial claim, the protective co-signature argument, dissolved when the federal forensic accountants completed their analysis of the pharmaceutical diversion records and established the controlled substance inventory discrepancies mapped directly to Vantage Defense Partners' distribution network. The numbers did not support protection. They supported profit. He was charged on day 11. He did not make a statement. Beverly Marsh was charged with federal conspiracy and obstruction on day 5. Her cooperation agreement, she had one, negotiated in the 48 hours following her arrest, with the particular pragmatism of someone who understood when a position had been fully overrun, provided the federal investigation with the complete communications record between herself and Reginald Pratt's network over 8 months. The record was comprehensive, detailed, and removed any remaining ambiguity about the nature of Harlow's recruitment to Crestfield Regional. Reginald Pratt's cooperation agreement was amended on day 3, after his attorneys concluded that the encrypted communications he was holding as leverage were less valuable to him as a negotiating tool than they were dangerous to him as evidence. He provided the decryption key. He provided his formal testimony. He provided everything. The amended agreement reduced his exposure significantly, which was the arrangement he had calculated and received, and which represented the specific kind of justice that was available in federal proceedings rather than the kind that existed in simpler stories, not satisfying, not clean, but real and consequential, and documented permanently in a federal record that would attach to his name for the remainder of his life. Harlow testified before the federal grand jury on day 8. She sat in a federal building in Spokane in clothes that were not scrubs, and she answered questions for 4 hours with the same quality she had brought to every other thing she had done in the past week, precisely, without embellishment, without the performance of emotion that she did not feel and would not have manufactured if she had. Philip Archer sat beside her. She did not look at him for guidance. She already knew what she knew. She testified about the CASVAC operation 4 years ago. She testified about what she had extracted, what she had carried, and what had been done to her in return. She testified about 14 months at Crestfield Regional and what she had observed and what she had reported and what had been done with those reports. She testified about the night of the Colburn explosion in the ordered sequential way that she had been trained to account for operational events, situation, action, outcome, without the gaps that invited misinterpretation. At one point, the federal attorney asked her how she had managed to function at a professional level for 14 months in an environment designed to undermine her. She thought about the question for a moment. "I had a job to do," she said. The job didn't change because the environment was hostile. The attorney wrote something down. Harlow did not ask what. Patrick Ossie testified the following day. She knew because Archer told her, and because she had spoken to Ossie twice more in the intervening days, not about the case, about other things, the way people who have been through something together speak about other things, because the direct approach to what they have shared is too large to address all at once and requires the negotiation of smaller conversations. First, he was living in Portland. He had a son, 12, who played baseball. He had been working in logistics and was thinking about going back to school. He sounded like a person who had been putting his life back together, one ordinary decision at a time, which she understood completely. On day 14, General Thomas Wicker arrived at the hospital for the last time. He came in the morning without the escort of officers he had brought on the first night in service dress, but without the full formality of the initial visit, present as a person rather than as an institution's representative, which was a distinction she noticed and appreciated. They met in the same family consultation room where he had first told her the truth. He placed 2 items on the table. The first was a formal letter from the Department of the Army, signed at a level that indicated the restoration of her record had been treated as a matter of institutional significance rather than routine correction. It confirmed her rank, her service history, her commendations, and contained a formal apology, not the bureaucratic apology of a form letter, but a paragraph that appeared to have been written by a person who understood what was being apologized for and had made a deliberate choice about how to say it. The second item was a shadow box. Inside it, mounted on dark fabric, was the Distinguished Service Medal, with the citation that accompanied it, a citation that accounted for the CASVAC operation. 4 years ago, the personnel extracted and the evidence preserved that had ultimately dismantled a 6-year procurement fraud network operating inside the United States military contracting system. She looked at both items on the table. The medal should have come 4 years ago, Wicker said. Yes, she said. It should have. He didn't try to fill that space with anything. She credited him for that more than almost anything else he had done. She picked up the shadow box. She looked at the medal and the citation for a long moment, and she thought about a version of herself 4 years younger, sitting in a formal proceeding watching her record be dismantled line by people who had decided she was more useful as an example than as a witness. She thought about the specific experience of being told by institutions she had trusted that her perception of events was incorrect and that her record of service was a liability rather than a credential. She thought about what it had taken to survive that. Not the dramatic version, not the version that made it into narratives. The actual version, the daily, unglamorous, expensive work of maintaining function in the absence of validation. Of continuing to be useful when usefulness was the only argument she had left for her own continuity. She set the shadow box down. The hospital board contacted me, she said, 3 days ago. Wicker raised an eyebrow slightly. They're reconstituting the clinical leadership structure. New medical director. External review of nursing administration. They offered me a position. She paused. Director of Patient Safety and Clinical Integrity. Direct reporting to the board, independent of the medical hierarchy. What did you tell them? She looked at him. I told them I'd think about it. He waited. I've thought about it, she said. I'm going to take it. Not because they offered it. I've been offered things before by institutions that were trying to manage me. But because the position has actual authority over the things I've been flagging for 14 months, and because if I don't take it, whoever takes it next may not push as hard. She paused. And because the floor needs someone in that role who has been on the floor, not above it. Wicker looked at her with something that was not quite a smile and not quite the formal expression of a senior officer conducting official business. It was the expression of someone who had been watching a person be underestimated by a sequence of institutions and had arrived at the moment of watching those institutions reckon with the cost of that underestimation. That seems right, he said. She picked up the letter and the shadow box. General, she said, standing. I hope the next time we're in a room together, it's because something is going well. So do I, he said. Major. She carried the shadow box and the letter back through the corridor, through the administrative section that was still in the process of being rebuilt from the inside out, and onto the trauma floor that was running the way a trauma floor ran at mid-morning, full, loud, demanding, indifferent to the institutional history of the building it occupied, and requiring only the competence of the people who showed up to work it. She set the shadow box on the nursing station counter. Not prominently, she was not a person who required her recognition to be visible, but there where she could see it when she worked, which was different. Gary looked at it, then at her, then back at the floor, which was making its ordinary demands. The board called me this morning, he said carefully. I know. The director position. I know, Gary. He processed that. So you're staying. I'm staying. He nodded once, with the particular nod of someone who has just received information that reorganizes a number of other things. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. She was reviewing the morning's patient board when a voice at her elbow said her name, not the names that people on the floor used, Harlow or Sinclair, but the formal designation. Major Sinclair? She turned. A young man, mid-20s, wearing a visitor's badge, standing near the nursing station, with the specific quality of someone who had been working up to an approach for a few minutes before executing it. He was tall, with the posture of someone who had worn a uniform and still carried it in his spine. "I'm Ryan Briggs," he said. "Warren Briggs's son. My dad's being discharged from the ICU today. He asked me to come find you." He paused. "He said you were the one who—" He stopped, looked at the floor briefly, and then back at her. "He said you kept him breathing." She looked at the young man, at the specific expression on his face, not dramatic, not performing gratitude, but genuine in the way that made genuine things feel different from their imitations. "Your dad kept himself breathing," she said. "I just made room for it." Ryan Briggs looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to say the next thing. "He said to tell you," he cleared his throat. "He said to tell you that he heard you. When he was going under, he said he heard a woman's voice, and it was telling him to stay, and he did." He paused. "He wanted you to know that it mattered." She held that. "Tell him I'm glad he stayed," she said, "and tell him." She paused. "Tell him his daughter is lucky." The young man nodded. He left. She turned back to the board. The floor was doing what floors did, generating need, generating work, generating the continuous, ordinary demand of human bodies requiring attention and skill, and the specific kind of care that existed at the intersection of knowledge and presence. It was not a perfect system. It never had been. The institution around it was imperfect and had demonstrated that imperfection at a level that had cost real people, real things, years, reputations, careers, and in cases that the ongoing federal review was still documenting, possibly more. But the floor ran. And Harlow Sinclair, who had been dismissed and sidelined and filed and monitored and maneuvered and underestimated in ways both deliberate and habitual, stood at the nursing station of a trauma floor. She was now formally charged with making safer, and she looked at the board, and she did what she had done on the hardest days of the last 4 years and the hardest night of the last 14 months. She got to work. Later, not that day, not even that week, but later, in the quieter space that followed the immediate aftermath, she would try to articulate. For the purposes of her formal testimony to a Senate Oversight Subcommittee examining military, contractor, and institutional accountability, what the experience of those 14 months and that one night had taught her, she would write several drafts. She would discard most of them. What she finally submitted was not long. It said that institutions were not abstract. They were the accumulated decisions of the people inside them, and those people made choices every day about whether to speak or to be silent, whether to document or to let things pass undocumented, whether to trust their own assessment of a situation or to defer to the comfort of the hierarchy. It said that the most dangerous feature of corrupt systems was not the people who actively maintained them, but the ordinary people who chose the path of least conflict and told themselves the path of least conflict was neutral. It said that she had worked beside someone for 14 months who had made that choice, and it had cost people things they would not fully recover, and it had nearly cost much more. It said that the antidote to that was not heroism. It was not the dramatic intervention of the person who knew better, Zistine. The antidote was the daily, ordinary, unglamorous act of saying what you saw, flagging what you found, documenting what happened, and refusing to let the discomfort of conflict persuade you that silence was acceptable. It said that she had tried to do that, imperfectly, for 14 months, on a floor that had been arranged to make it impossible. She had done it anyway. The last line of her submitted statement was not a policy recommendation and not a systemic prescription. It was a sentence she had turned over for several days before deciding it was the right one to end on. The woman they tried to make invisible, she wrote, found that visibility was the only thing they were ever actually afraid of. She submitted it. She went back to the floor. The trauma doors were open. She walked through them.